All right, hello y'all. My name is Christelle Salomon and I received a stem cell transplant this past January of 2022. So although I am super happy about the decision, it was definitely a really tough decision to make. So there are 5 guiding pillars that I use to help me make that decision. So the first one is understanding the transplant process itself. Second one is understanding my health at the time and my health trends over time. My third one was understanding the eligibility criteria for the transplant. The fourth one was thinking about the pros and cons of the transplant in different time frames. And lastly, but definitely not least, understanding the alternative treatment options that are available to me. So let's jump into how I made the decision to undergo a stem cell transplant. Y'all, I went back to my notes where I originally wrote my thoughts down, and I was scrolling through, all the things that I was putting down in order to process, deciding whether or not I should do something as life-altering as a transplant. And it's just bringing me back, y'all. It's bringing me back, and it's a little bit crazy in a good way, Anywho, I'm done talking about that. So I knew that the very first step that I needed to take in terms of helping me with making this decision was understanding the transplant process itself. I knew that the transplant wasn't just like this super simple thing where the donor cells come out, they go into me, and then bing, bam, boom, it's all done, poof. But I also didn't really know any of the fine granular details about pre-transplant, during transplant, post-transplant. And so I really wanted to educate myself on those things first. If you want a brief 15-minute summary about the transplant process from beginning to end, definitely check out my video on my channel. It's like a one-take wonder. So definitely check that video out if you want a simple overview. But I do have some resources to provide to you all if you want more in-depth information, and also just like definitely a lot more credible sources than me. Although I've been through it and I know things from my experience, it's really important to go to really trustworthy sources to get your information about the transplant. So BMT InfoNet is an organization that was created with the sole purpose of providing resources for patients who've undergone some sort of stem cell or blood transplant. Their website is super clear and concise. They have a lot of videos and tidbits of information for people who are considering the transplant, people who are caregivers of patients who have received a transplant, as well as understanding the complications that come with transplant, like graft versus host disease. And so that's a really great place to start. They also they host a symposium every single year, and then they save those recordings and they send them out to people for free. And so you can subscribe to be part of their email chain and receive their newsletters, and those typically include the videos about fatigue post-transplant, exercise post-transplant, having sex post-transplant, the complications of certain cancers specific to transplant. And so they get into the nitty-gritty details of anything you could possibly want to know. So I highly recommend going to that website. So the American Society of Hematology, aka ASH, is also another place where you can get lots of information about sickle cell disease, malignant blood disorders, other benign blood disorders, and transplant. And ASH and BMT InfoNet have quite a few long lecture type videos that are 45 minutes to an hour long of experts in that field really going in about the information that they're talking about, and then fielding questions from patients and providers. And a lot of that stuff is free on YouTube. So I remember watching hours of lectures about transplant in patients with sickle cell disease, transplant in patients with cancer, transplant complications, as well as GVHD. I watched hours and hours and hours of those videos, but it was just really helpful to get the information over and over in different contexts. And it really helped me to feel like transplant wasn't this big scary unknown, but that I could really break down each part and understand the risks and the benefits of each phase of the transplant. And then I straight up just searched, like, I think it was like transplant vlog. It was like stem cell transplant vlogs, bone marrow transplant vlogs. I just wanted to see people's experiences, and so I typed that into the good old YouTube, and I found a few patients who had cancer who had received stem cell transplants. I found a medical student who had cancer and received a stem cell transplant, so that was really awesome. There were not as many people with sickle cell who had undergone transplant sharing their experiences on YouTube, and so I was kind of like sad about that, which is part of what inspired me to document my transplant journey, because I realized it's, you know, even though watching someone's transplant journey with cancer is really eye-opening and gives you a lot of insight about how the process is going to work, cancer and sickle cell are just not the same. Just like, you know, AML is not the same as APL, is not the same as CLL. You know, each diagnosis has its own unique characteristics, and those do factor into what the conditioning regimen looks like, what the whole transplant process looks like. And I want to see people with sickle cell going through transplant. So there were a few patients with sickle cell who shared their experiences that I did see, and I highly recommend all of them. The first one is Be the Match. They have all sorts of videos, but they specifically had this one patient. She had sickle cell disease, was probably in her late teens, I can't remember. And she documented a little bit of her journey with like 3 vlogs, two or three vlogs about her experience. They never actually ended up doing like a follow-up about her recovery, but it was still good to see the process nonetheless. And then there's also this woman, her channel name is My Sickled Cells. I think her name is Reve. She has a really nice name, so I'm really sad that I don't remember it. But anywho, she is Canadian, and she also documented her experience with sickle cell disease and receiving a transplant. And she actually did the same exact conditioning regimen that I received. And so it was just really nice to see exactly how it was going to work from a technical and medical standpoint. And then there's one more patient who was also a bit younger, I think 18 or 19, and he received a like standard myeloablative conditioning regimen. And even though I ended up not doing that route, it was good to watch his videos and see what it was like, because it was an option on the table for me. So those are the 3 patients with sickle cell who have shared their transplant journeys online that I recommend. And if I'm missing anyone, please comment it down below, because I love watching other people with sickle cell, because it makes me feel like I'm not alone and I have someone I can relate to. Lastly, my mentor shared with me this amazing website called sickleoptions.org. And this is like a more refined version of my YouTube search for people's experiences with sickle cell disease and transplant. And so what I liked about this website was that it had videos for people who are interested in starting one of the disease-modifying drugs. It had videos for people interested in stem cell transplant. It had videos for people interested in gene therapy. And they were very raw, short videos, like 2 to 5 minutes long, of people in different stages of their transplant process. And they also interviewed like the parents. They showed, you know, examples of people where it's an ultimate success. They show examples of people where they ended up rejecting the transplant, and they showed examples of people who passed away, unfortunately. And so it was just a very unbiased look at all the potential outcomes from the transplant, and that was really important for me to know going in. I didn't want to go in with rose-colored glasses thinking that, oh, this is gonna be the cure-all for everything. Like, there are a lot of dang risks with this process, and so I wanted to know all of them so that I can make an informed decision about how I would move forward. All right, so the second step, or second pillar of my decision-making process, was really understanding my current state of health at the time that I made the decision, and also my health trends over the past decade or so. So up until my second year of medical school, I was making the mistake of conflating my professional and career and academic success with my physical wellness and well-being. And so in my mind, that's how I always operated. Well, since I'm doing well in school and I'm doing well at my job, then I must be well. And it's honestly just really interesting and a little bit bizarre to me, because I knew, subconsciously or consciously, I knew that I was suffering physically because I had pain every single day. But for one reason or another, I sort of thought that, hey, well, since I am having a good day at work and since I am learning new things and I did well on my exam, I figured that since I am surviving this world in this sort of like capitalistic and output-based society, since I am able to do those things, then everything must be fine and I should just keep moving forward. But when I took the time to actually reflect back on my health and understand how it was impacting my life, I realized that I was actually pretty miserable and had been for some time. I just didn't really take the time to really acknowledge it. I think that genuinely understanding your state of health, its impact on your life, your quality of life, it's really important to know where you are at and how your health has been changing over time in order to make an informed decision about whether or not you should pursue transplant. So thirdly, I made sure to educate myself on the eligibility criteria for the stem cell transplant. Transplant for adults with sickle cell disease is actually not considered standard of care, which means at most hospitals, in order to receive a transplant as an adult with sickle cell disease, you have to go through a clinical trial. I went to clinicaltrials.gov and basically typed in the keywords transplant, sickle cell disease, and searched through all the clinical trials across the nation that were doing anything of the sort. And for each trial, I basically just read through the eligibility criteria, and I also checked to see if the trial was open and recruiting patients. And so that gave me an idea of, okay, these are the places that I could potentially get a transplant if I end up pursuing that route. And honestly, I feel like the field of medicine has really been complacent in accepting that patients with sickle cell disease will suffer. And I used to think there's no way you would qualify for transplant because you're not, your organs haven't failed yet and you're still functioning and going to school, so therefore I'm not sick enough for a transplant. But in the meantime, if I had thought about it with a holistic mindset, it's okay, my health has been getting worse over the past few years and I understand that. And then coupled with the information about the eligibility, I was wait, I actually do qualify for transplant based on the eligibility criteria that's listed here. And so it gave me just concrete facts about whether or not my disease was severe enough, as opposed to society's idea of what's severe and me feeling I'm fine, I don't deserve this. I was I want to separate feelings from facts. I want facts. And so that's why I think it's really important to go on the website and look for the eligibility criteria yourself, because that way you can be informed about what you qualify for and what is actually in the realm of possibilities for you and your condition. So the fourth, is it the fourth? Yes. The fourth thing I think is really important to consider is weighing the pros and cons of your transplant timeline. So let me explain that. So I listed the pros and cons of doing transplant, ASAP, saying, okay, I'm going for it and starting that process now. And then I also weighed the pros and cons of, delaying the transplant, doing it a little bit later. And that for me was really eye-opening because I don't know how to explain it. The transplant itself has its own risks, but living with the disease has risks as well. And so basically just finding that balance. So let's say I was at a place where I'm feeling really good with my health and I haven't experienced many complications and I'm not really going to the hospital, then, you know, maybe a transplant isn't for me at this time, because medicine hasn't like revolutionized, you know, transplants yet where it becomes super available to everyone. But then maybe I'm like, okay, well, because I'm feeling okay and, you know, transplant has a lot of risks, maybe I'll table it for another time if I end up needing it. But also, there's another side of the coin where it's like, well, I'm already starting to get worse, and if I delay my transplant, I could keep getting worse. And then those challenges that come with a worsening condition don't undo themselves with the transplant. And so it was really important for me to understand the pros and cons of waiting for doing the transplant and the pros and cons of doing the transplant right away. And for me personally, my disease was worsening, and I could feel that every single day with my pain. I had AVN in both my shoulders, at least my left hip, and I think my left knee. Basically, I had AVN in multiple joints that thankfully was really early on, but if you let the AVN get worse and eventually need a joint replacement, a transplant can't fix that. Right? Just weigh the pros and cons of pursuing the transplant now versus pursuing the transplant later, depending on the risks of the transplant and the risks of your disease getting worse. That is the short way of putting it. I could go down a rabbit hole about why I decided to go my route, but it's going to take too long. So I hope that makes sense. Last but not least is understanding the alternative treatment options, okay? Y'all, like, I went in knowing I wanted to do the transplant because I thought it might be the best thing for me at this time, but I also was like putting my feelers out for everything else too, because I was like, what if the transplant doesn't work? What if XYZ? What if I try this drug and it works? So I tried a lot of the disease modifying therapies because I thought, you know, well, I've been living with sickle cell all my life, and if I can reduce the damage that the disease causes on my body by taking this medication every day or going to get an infusion every month, and that's all I have to do instead of going through this crazy transplant process, I'm happy to do that. And so it was really important for me to understand all of the disease modifying therapies, which ones would be great to try. And so I tried 3 out of the 4 before I decided on the transplant. And then also there are new studies coming up for gene therapy and, you know, weighing the pros and cons. Like, would you rather do a stem cell transplant, or let's say you don't want to do a stem cell transplant, or you don't have a sibling, you don't have someone to donate any cells to you, then you could wait for gene therapy trials that are open. And so just understanding all of your options and which route is the best for you. So for me personally, I was like, oh, gene therapy is pretty cool too, but gene therapy, because it's still experimental, a lot of the clinical trials exclude patients who have a known match sibling donor, which makes sense because we want to reserve gene therapy for people who really don't have any other option. And so for me, I was like, even though gene therapy looks cool, I'm not going to be able to do that because Carl, thank God, is a perfect match to me. So gene therapy was out the window, and I had tried all the disease modifying therapies that were out the window, and so transplant became the only thing that was the right step. And so understanding your different options can help you to decide, you know, if transplant is the right thing for you, or would you prefer to use a disease modifying therapy or gene therapy or something else altogether. And based on all that research and reflection, I was able to come to the decision, like a really good, solid, peaceful decision, that the transplant process was the right thing for me to pursue. And making that decision is such a huge feat. You really should like pat yourself on the back for really digging through all of these crazy medical unknowns and trying to figure out what the best thing for you is. And making that decision is really just the beginning, but that in itself is a monumental step. Anywho, thank you for listening to this video. If you made it this far, comment down below the compass emoji as a sign for helping people that you know and helping yourself be guided in the right direction through your actions. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share the video. It helps me to reach my mission of increasing awareness about sickle cell disease and also creating positive change in the field of medicine. Thanks a lot. Until next time, doodles!